September 13, 1966, Binh Dinh Province on the central coast of South Vietnam, a region of stark contrasts where lush rice paddies met jungle-covered mountains, where 800,000 Vietnamese lived in villages and towns that had known war for generations, where the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese had established control so complete that the CIA reported in '65 that the province was just about lost to the communists. This was the setting for Operation Thayer, the largest air assault conducted up to that point in the Vietnam War, an operation that would last through October and that would be followed by two more massive operations, Irving and Thayer II, a sustained 5-month campaign that would kill over 2,500 enemy soldiers and 329 Americans, and that would displace 129,000 civilians, and that ultimately would prove that even massive military operations couldn't hold territory that the enemy was determined to control. Binh Dinh Province stretched along the coast of the South China Sea, a narrow strip of heavily cultivated coastal plain where generations of Vietnamese had grown rice and paddies watered by 7 rivers that flowed from the mountains to the sea. These rivers, the Song Con, Song Bong, Song Lai Jiang, and 4 others, came together in a region the Americans called the Crow's Foot because of how the valleys converged, creating a network of waterways separated by ridges and mountains that provided natural defensive positions and that made movement difficult for large military forces. The province had been a communist stronghold since the First Indochina War against the French. The Viet Minh had operated here in the 1950s, had built networks of supporters among the population, had established base areas in the mountains where they could train and arm and prepare for operations against the French colonial forces. When Vietnam was divided in 1954, and when the insurgency against the South Vietnamese government began in the late 50s, Binh Dinh was ready-made territory for the Viet Cong, already had the political infrastructure and popular support and knowledge of terrain that made successful guerrilla warfare possible. By 1966, the communist forces in Binh Dinh Province weren't just guerrillas conducting hit-and-run attacks. They were organized military units, battalions, and regiments of the People's Army of Vietnam, the PAVN, regular North Vietnamese soldiers who'd infiltrated south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and who'd joined with local Viet Cong forces to create the PAV 3rd Division. This division included 2 regiments of North Vietnamese regulars, the 18th and 22nd PAVN regiments, and 1 regiment of Main Force Viet Cong, the 2nd VC Regiment, a combined force of approximately 6,000 fighters with automatic weapons and mortars and recoilless rifles and all the equipment of a conventional military formation. The 3rd Division controlled much of the land and many of the people of Binh Dinh Province. They taxed the farmers, recruited young men into their ranks, gathered intelligence on South Vietnamese and American forces, conducted attacks on government outposts and on convoys traveling Highway 1, the main coastal road that connected the cities and towns of the province. The South Vietnamese 22nd ARVN Division was responsible for security in Binh Dinh, but was spread thin and was focused primarily on keeping Highway 19 open, the road that ran from the coast inland to Pleiku, and that was critical for supplying American forces in the Central Highlands. The population of Binh Dinh was caught between the 2 sides, between the communist forces who controlled the countryside and the South Vietnamese government that controlled the provincial capital of Quy Nhon and a few other district towns. Many villagers supported the Viet Cong either because they believed in the cause or because they had no choice, because refusing to cooperate meant death or imprisonment or having your village burned. Others supported the government or tried to remain neutral, tried to survive by avoiding both sides as much as possible, by paying taxes to whoever demanded them, and by not volunteering information to anyone. The strategic importance of Binh Dinh Province was significant. The province was on the coast, which meant it had access to the sea and to supplies that could be brought in by boat. It bordered the Central Highlands, which meant it was a gateway between the coastal lowlands and the mountains where major North Vietnamese forces operated. It was heavily populated, which meant it was a source of recruits and supplies and intelligence for whoever controlled it. And it was right in the middle of South Vietnam's coastal region, which meant that communist control of Binh Dinh threatened to cut the country in half to separate the northern provinces from the southern, provinces and to demonstrate that the government in Saigon couldn't protect even the coastal areas where population was concentrated. Before we can understand Operation Thayer, we need to understand what came before it. Need to understand Operation Masher, the massive search and destroy mission that the 1st Cavalry Division had conducted in Binh Dinh Province in January and February of 1966, 7 months before Thayer began. Operation Masher was supposed to have solved the Binh Dinh problem, was supposed to have driven out the communist forces and re-established government control. The fact that Operation Thayer was necessary 7 months later demonstrated that Masher hadn't accomplished its objectives, that the enemy had returned to areas they'd been driven out of, that the pattern of American operations followed by communist return was already well established. Operation Masher began on January 24, 66, and lasted until March 6, over 6 weeks of sustained operations by the 1st Cavalry Division, working with South Vietnamese and South Korean forces. The operation was the largest search and destroy mission conducted up to that point in the Vietnam War, involved multiple battalions operating across a 30-mile wide area, utilized massive firepower, including B-52 strikes and artillery bombardments and helicopter gunships and tactical air support. The 1st Cavalry Division, officially the 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile, was a unique formation in the American military. It had been reorganized and retrained to conduct helicopter operations, to use the UH-1 Huey helicopters as transport for infantry soldiers, to conduct air assaults where entire battalions could be lifted into combat zones in a matter of hours, to move forces rapidly across terrain that would take days to traverse on foot. The division had proven its capabilities in the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley in November of '65, had fought North Vietnamese forces in sustained combat in the Central Highlands, had demonstrated that American mobility and firepower could defeat enemy forces in conventional battles. Operation Masher was designed to use these capabilities in Binh Dinh Province, to conduct air assaults into the valleys and mountains, to trap enemy forces between blocking positions and attacking forces, to find and fix and finish the PAVN 3rd Division and drive them out of the province. The operation was partially successful in military terms. The Americans claimed to have killed over 2,000 enemy soldiers during Masher, had destroyed base camps and captured supplies and weapons, had demonstrated that American forces could operate throughout Binh Dinh despite communist control. But Operation Masher also demonstrated problems that would recur in Operation Thayer and in every other large operation in Vietnam. The enemy avoided decisive battle when possible, broke into smaller units, and dispersed when American forces arrived in strength, hid among the civilian population or in base areas in the mountains where they couldn't be found. The massive firepower that the Americans used, the artillery and airstrikes, and the sweeps by ground forces, created enormous numbers of refugees, civilians who fled their villages either to escape the fighting or because they were forcibly relocated by American and South Vietnamese forces. By the time Operation Masher ended in early March of '66, approximately 125,000 people in Binh Dinh Province had been displaced from their homes, had become refugees living in camps or in towns or along Highway 1. The Americans portrayed this as people fleeing communism, as evidence that the population preferred government control to Viet Cong control. But internal American studies concluded that the primary cause of refugee movement was American and South Vietnamese bombing and artillery fire combined with ground operations, that people were fleeing the war itself rather than fleeing from one side to the other. And within months of Operation Masher's conclusion, the PAVN 3rd Division was back in Binh Dinh Province. The 18th and 22nd PAVN regiments and the 2nd VC Regiment had withdrawn during Masher, had avoided major battles, had preserved their forces. They'd moved to sanctuaries in the mountains or across the border, into Cambodia or into neighboring Quang Ngai Province. They'd waited for the American forces to redeploy to other areas for other operations. And then they'd come back, had re-established their base areas in the Kim Sun Valley and the Sui Ka Valley and the other valleys where they'd operated before, had resumed recruiting and training and operations. By September of '66, intelligence reports indicated that the PAVN 3rd Division had re-established its base areas in the Crow's Foot region of Binh Dinh, in exactly the same areas where the 1st Cavalry had fought during Operation Masher. The same ground would have to be Fought over again, the same valleys would have to be assaulted again. The same pattern of American operations followed by enemy return was beginning its next cycle. To understand Operation Thayer, you need to understand the 1st Cavalry Division and how it operated. Need to understand what airmobile warfare meant and why the division was uniquely suited for operations in Binh Dinh Province's difficult terrain. The 1st Cavalry wasn't a traditional infantry division that moved on foot or in trucks, and that relied on artillery for supporting fire. The 1st Cav was built around helicopters, around the concept that mobility and firepower could be combined in ways that conventional forces couldn't match. The division had approximately 400 helicopters of various types. The workhorse was the UH-1 Huey, the utility helicopter that became iconic of the Vietnam War, that distinctive sound of rotor blades chopping through humid air, that could carry 8 to 10 soldiers plus crew. That could be used for assault insertions or for medical evacuation, or for resupply or for command and control. The division had hundreds of Hueys organized into aviation battalions, units of pilots and crew chiefs and door gunners who flew constant missions supporting ground operations. The division also had Huey gunships, UH-1s modified with machine guns and rocket pods, that provided close air support during assaults and that could respond quickly when ground units made contact with enemy forces. These gunships, which would later be replaced by the AH-1 Cobra attack helicopter, flew in teams providing covering fire for transport helicopters during insertions and extractions, suppressing enemy positions with rockets and machine gun fire, making it possible for infantry to land in hot landing zones where the enemy was present and prepared to fight. The division had CH-47 Chinook helicopters, heavy-lift twin-rotor aircraft that could carry artillery pieces and ammunition and supplies, that could move 155mm howitzers to fire-based positions in the mountains where they could support operations. That made it possible for the division to establish artillery support anywhere within its area of operations without relying on roads. This capability was critical in Binh Dinh Province, where roads were few and where moving supplies overland was slow and vulnerable to ambush. The division also had OH-13 and OH-6 Scout helicopters, small light observation aircraft that flew low and slow, searching for enemy forces, that drew fire so that gunships could engage the enemy positions, that provided reconnaissance and intelligence that ground commanders needed for planning operations. These scout pilots flew the most dangerous missions in the division, flying at treetop level over terrain where enemy forces might be anywhere, deliberately trying to get shot at so they could identify enemy positions. The infantry battalions of the 1st Cavalry operated differently from conventional infantry. Instead of patrolling on foot for days or weeks, instead of establishing company-sized patrol bases and operating from them, the 1st Cav conducted air assaults, helicopter insertions of company-size or battalion-size forces into landing zones that had been selected based on intelligence and reconnaissance. The infantry would secure the LZ, would patrol outward from it, searching for enemy forces or base camps or supplies, would be extracted by helicopter when the mission was complete, or when contact with the enemy required reinforcement, or when casualties needed medical evacuation. This mobility gave the 1st Cavalry enormous advantages. They could move forces rapidly across Binh Dinh Province's difficult terrain, could conduct operations in the mountains and valleys without depending on roads, could reinforce units in contact within minutes rather than hours, could mass forces at critical points, and then disperse them to other areas as needed. The enemy couldn't predict where air assaults would occur, couldn't prepare defenses for every possible landing zone, couldn't avoid American forces by moving to remote areas because helicopters could reach those areas as easily as accessible ones. But airmobile warfare also had limitations and costs. Helicopters were vulnerable to ground fire, to machine guns and small arms fire from enemy forces, to accidents caused by weather or mechanical failures. The 1st Cavalry lost helicopters constantly during operations. Aircraft shot down or crashed. Pilots and crew killed or wounded. Expensive machines destroyed. The division also required enormous logistical support. Thousands of gallons of aviation fuel daily. Spare parts for helicopters, ammunition for the infantry, and for the gunships. a supply chain that was complex and that absorbed resources that might have been used elsewhere. By September of 1966, the situation in Binh Dinh Province was deteriorating rapidly despite the 1st Cavalry's presence at Camp Radcliffe near An Khe, and despite the South Vietnamese 22nd Division's responsibility for the province. The Communist forces were becoming more aggressive, were conducting more attacks, were demonstrating that Operation Masher hadn't driven them out permanently, and that they retained capability to threaten American and South Vietnamese positions. On the night of September 3rd, a Viet Cong platoon launched a mortar attack on Camp Radcliffe that demonstrated both the boldness of enemy forces and the vulnerability of even heavily defended American bases. The attack began after dark, mortar crews firing from positions outside the base perimeter, dropping shells onto the helicopter parking areas and onto the base facilities where soldiers lived and worked. The attack lasted only 5 minutes, but in that short time, 119 mortar rounds hit the base, a sustained barrage that killed 4 American soldiers and wounded 76. The damage to helicopters was even more severe. 77 of the division's 400-plus helicopters were damaged by the mortar fire, some destroyed completely, others damaged enough that they required extensive repairs before they could fly again. For a division that depended on helicopters for everything it did, for a unit whose entire operational concept was built around airmobile operations, losing 77 aircraft in 5 minutes was catastrophic. It would take weeks to repair or replace the damaged helicopters, weeks during which the division's operational capability was significantly reduced. The Viet Cong platoon that conducted the attack escaped without being caught. They'd moved into position under cover of darkness, had pre-registered their mortars on targets within the base, had fired their barrage, and then had withdrawn before American forces could respond. The attack demonstrated that the enemy had intelligence on the base layout, knew where helicopters were parked, knew where personnel were concentrated, knew how to conduct effective hit-and-run attacks that inflicted maximum damage with minimal risk. In early September, Communist forces also attacked several South Vietnamese military bases in Binh Dinh Province and ambushed an ARVN convoy on Highway 1, demonstrating that the threat wasn't limited to American forces, but extended to the South Vietnamese units that were supposed to be providing security for the province. These attacks illustrated the fragility of government control in Binh Dinh, demonstrated that the South Vietnamese couldn't protect their own bases and convoys without American support, showed that the situation required another major American operation if the province wasn't going to be completely lost to communist control. The intelligence picture in early September indicated that the PAVN 3rd Division had re-established its base areas in the Kim Son Valley and surrounding areas, in the same Crow's Foot region where the 1st Cavalry had fought during Operation Masher. The division's 3 regiments, the 18th and 22nd PAVN and the 2nd VC, were believed to be operating from these base areas, conducting training and recruiting and preparing for operations. The base areas included fortified positions, bunkers and trenches and fighting positions that had been constructed over years, supply caches where rice and ammunition and equipment were stored, trails and paths that allowed movement through the mountains. Major General John Norton, who'd taken command of the 1st Cavalry Division in May of '66, was given the mission of planning and executing another major operation in Binh Dinh Province, an operation designed to eliminate the PAVN 3rd Division's presence in the Kim Son Valley and surrounding areas. Norton understood from Operation Masher that defeating the enemy in Binh Dinh wasn't going to be easy, that the Communists had demonstrated their ability to avoid decisive battle and to return after American forces withdrew. But he also understood that allowing the enemy to operate freely in Binh Dinh was unacceptable, that the province was too important strategically to concede to communist control. Norton's plan for Operation Thayer was based on the airmobile capabilities that made the 1st Cavalry unique. He would conduct a massive air assault, the largest up to that point in the Vietnam War, lifting 5 battalions into the highlands surrounding the Kim Son Valley simultaneously, establishing blocking positions that would prevent enemy forces from escaping, and then having those battalions descend into the valleys searching for communist forces and base areas. The concept was to create a giant net to trap the PAVN 3rd Division between converging American forces, to force them into battles where American firepower would be decisive. The operation would be preceded by B-52 strikes, massive aerial bombardments by Air Force strategic bombers flying from bases in Guam and Thailand, dropping tons of high-explosive bombs on suspected enemy positions and base areas. These strikes were designed to destroy fortifications, to kill enemy soldiers, to disrupt communist plans, and to demoralize defenders before American ground forces arrived. B-52 strikes were terrifying, even for troops who weren't directly hit. The sound of bombs falling from aircraft flying so high they couldn't be seen or heard until the explosions started, the ground shaking from impacts that cratered the earth and that destroyed everything within the blast radius. Norton also planned to use artillery extensively during Operation Thayer to establish fire-base positions throughout the operational area, to position 105mm and 155mm howitzers, where they could support the infantry battalions operating in the valleys, to provide responsive fire when units made contact with enemy forces. The artillery would be moved by Chinook helicopters, lifted into fire-base positions on hilltops or ridges, protected by infantry security detachments, ready to fire missions day or night in support of operations. The operation would also involve South Vietnamese and South Korean forces, battalions that would operate in coordination with the 1st Cavalry, searching areas and blocking escape routes and conducting their own operations against communist forces. This combined approach was designed both to increase the number of forces available for the operation and to demonstrate Allied unity, to show that multiple nations were cooperating in the fight against communist aggression in Vietnam. Operation Thayer officially began on September 13, 1966, with the air assault phase, the simultaneous insertion of 5 1st Cavalry battalions into landing zones in the highlands surrounding the Kim Sun Valley. This was the largest air assault conducted up to that point in the Vietnam War, a complex operation requiring coordination of hundreds of helicopters and thousands of soldiers, timing that had to be precise to ensure that all units inserted at roughly the same time and could begin their missions without enemy forces escaping between gaps in the net. The air assault began after dawn, waves of Huey transport helicopters lifting from staging areas at Camp Radcliffe and other bases, flying in formation toward the landing zones that had been selected for the operation. Each helicopter carried 8 to 10 soldiers, weapons and equipment and ammunition and water and everything they'd need for operations in the field. The helicopters flew in groups called serials, 20 or 30 aircraft moving together with gunship escorts providing covering fire, command and control helicopters coordinating the insertions, scout helicopters checking landing zones before the main force arrived. The landing zones were mostly clearings in the jungle, or rice paddies, or hilltops where helicopters could land or where soldiers could jump off, while the helicopters hovered a few feet above the ground. Some of the LZs were cold, meaning no enemy forces were present, and the insertion went smoothly. Others were hot, meaning enemy forces were nearby and opened fire on the helicopters as they approached, or as soldiers were disembarking. The sudden violence of combat, machine gun fire, and explosions. Soldiers returning fire while still in the helicopters or immediately after landing. Gunships engaging enemy positions with rockets and machine guns. By the afternoon of September 14th, all 5 battalions had been inserted into their landing zones and had begun establishing security perimeters and preparing to begin their descent into the valleys. The insertions had gone relatively smoothly despite a few hot LZs. Casualties had been lighter than expected. The element of surprise had worked to some extent, even though the enemy must have known something was coming, given the B-52 strikes that had preceded the ground assault. But as the battalions began moving, down from the highlands into the Kim Sun Valley and surrounding areas, as they swept through the terrain searching for enemy forces, they discovered something that would become a recurring problem throughout Operation Thayer and the operations that followed. The enemy wasn't there in the numbers intelligence had predicted. The PAVN 3rd Division's regiments weren't sitting in their base areas waiting to be attacked. They had detected the American preparations, had observed the B-52 strikes and the helicopter movements, had concluded that a major operation was beginning, and they'd done what they'd done during Operation Masher. They'd dispersed, had broken into smaller units, had moved out of the areas where the Americans were going to search. For the remainder of September, the 5 1st Cavalry Battalions conducting Operation Thayer swept through the Kim San Valley and surrounding valleys, searching for the PAVN 3rd Division's regiments, finding evidence of enemy presence but rarely, finding the enemy forces themselves in sufficient numbers to engage in the kind of decisive battles that American commanders wanted. This was the frustrating reality of search and destroy operations in Vietnam, that finding the enemy was often harder than destroying them once you found them, that the communists controlled when and where battles occurred by choosing to engage or to avoid engagement based on their assessment of the tactical situation. The battalions moved through difficult terrain, through jungle where visibility was measured in meters, through rice paddies where movement was slow and exposed, through villages where the population watched silently as American soldiers searched homes and questioned residents about Viet Cong activities. The searches of villages were conducted with interpreters when available. American soldiers and Vietnamese interpreters going from house to house looking for weapons or supplies or documents that might indicate Viet Cong presence. Sometimes finding rice stockpiled in quantities that suggested it was being stored for enemy forces. Sometimes finding medical supplies or ammunition. Occasionally finding weapons or equipment. The villagers in the Kim San Valley and surrounding areas were generally uncooperative with American forces. Some were genuinely afraid of retaliation if they provided information about Viet Cong activities, knew that the communists would kill anyone suspected of collaborating with the Americans or the South Vietnamese government. Some supported the Viet Cong, either ideologically or because family members were fighting with them. Some simply didn't trust the Americans, didn't believe that the government in Saigon represented their interests, wanted to be left alone to farm their land and raise their families without being caught in the middle of a war they hadn't chosen. The battalions did make occasional contact with enemy forces, brief firefights when they stumbled onto Viet Cong positions, or when patrols encountered enemy patrols, combat that lasted minutes or sometimes hours before one side or the other broke contact. These engagements demonstrated that enemy forces were still operating in the area, but they didn't result in the kind of major battles that would have indicated that the PAVN 3rd Division's regiments were standing and fighting. The enemy was there, but they were elusive, were avoiding the American forces, were preserving their strength rather than accepting battles where American firepower would be decisive. By the end of September, after 2 weeks of operations, the 1st Cavalry had learned that the enemy forces in the Kim San Valley had escaped to the east, had moved out of the valleys before the American air assault began, had relocated to the small mountain ranges near the coast where they could establish new defensive positions and continue operations. Intelligence indicated that the PAVN 12th Regiment, which intelligence had believed was in the Kim San Valley, had moved to the coastal mountains and was now operating in that area. This meant the focus of operations would have to shift, that the battalions searching the valleys would need to be reoriented toward the coast, that the operation would continue but in a different area. Operation Thayer officially ended on October 1st, 1966. The Americans claimed to have killed 231 enemy soldiers during the operation, at a loss to themselves of 35 killed and missing. By the standards of body count, the metric that American commanders used to measure success in Vietnam, Operation Thayer was a victory, a favorable exchange ratio that demonstrated American forces had inflicted more casualties than they had suffered. But, by any realistic assessment, Operation Thayer hadn't accomplished its primary objective of eliminating the PAVN 3rd Division's presence in the Kim San Valley, hadn't trapped enemy forces in the net that the air assault was supposed to create, hadn't prevented the enemy from relocating and continuing operations. SLA Marshall, the military historian who was in Vietnam observing operations, privately declared that Operation Thayer was a complete bust, that the artillery was shooting at clay pipes, that the enemy was either not there or so adroit and clever as to completely avoid American search and destroy tactics. Marshall's assessment was harsh, but it reflected the reality that American forces in Vietnam were fighting an enemy who wouldn't stand and fight unless conditions favored them, who could avoid American operations by dispersing and relocating, who could return to areas after American forces withdrew. Operation Irving began immediately after Operation Thayer ended, on October 2, 1966. The pursuit of the PAVN 12th Regiment and other enemy forces that had relocated to the coastal mountain ranges of Binh Dinh Province. This operation would demonstrate that when American forces could find and fix enemy units in terrain where escape was difficult, the results could be devastating for the Communists, could validate the firepower and mobility that the 1st Cavalry brought to operations. But Irving would also demonstrate the continued problems of civilian presence in combat zones and the refugee crisis that large operations created. The operational area for Irving was the small mountain ranges near the coast, massifs rising more than 1,000 feet from the coastal plain, covered with jungle vegetation, dotted with villages where farmers had lived for generations. The mountains extended over an area of about 15 miles north to south and about 5 miles inland from the sea. Terrain that was more confined than the Kim Sun Valley, that offered fewer escape routes for enemy forces once they were located, that favored the attacking forces if they could surround enemy positions. General Norton assembled a combined force of approximately 6,000 men for Operation Thayer. Irving, including 5 American battalions from the 1st Cavalry, 5 South Korean battalions from the Capital Division, and 2 South Vietnamese battalions. Each national contingent would search a different mountain massif, would conduct coordinated operations designed to prevent enemy forces from escaping from one area to another, would trap the PAVN 12th Regiment and other communist units between converging forces. The problem that immediately became apparent during Operation Irving was the large number of civilians in the operational area. The coastal plain was heavily populated, farming villages every few kilometers, rice paddies and gardens and homes where hundreds of thousands of people lived and worked. Unlike the more remote Kim Sun Valley, where population was sparse, the coastal area was densely inhabited, which meant that military operations would inevitably affect civilians, that distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants would be difficult, that the use of artillery and airstrikes would carry enormous risk of civilian casualties. The Americans attempted to address this problem by dropping leaflets and broadcasting radio messages instructing civilians to stay in their villages unless fighting occurred, and if it did, to leave only in the direction of Allied soldiers, not toward enemy positions. The instructions were well-intentioned, but often impractical. Villagers caught in combat didn't always know which direction was toward Allied forces and which was toward enemy positions. The sounds of battle were confusing, artillery and small arms fire coming from multiple directions, helicopters overhead, explosions from airstrikes. And many villagers didn't trust either side, feared that if they moved toward American or South Vietnamese forces, they'd be treated as Viet Cong suspects, that if they stayed in their villages, they'd be caught in crossfire. Despite these problems, Operation Irving achieved significant success in military terms. October 12th, elements of the 1st Cavalry encountered a large enemy force at the village of Hoa Hoi, and in the ensuing battle killed approximately 200 enemy soldiers. This engagement, the Battle of Hoa Hoi, was exactly the kind of decisive combat that American commanders wanted. Enemy forces fixed in position and destroyed by superior firepower. A battle that demonstrated what could happen when the Communists couldn't avoid engagement. Following the Hoa Hoi battle, American forces continued searching for additional enemy units, shifting operations westward to the mountainous Kim Sun and Soi Ka valleys, where intelligence indicated enemy forces might have relocated. South Korean forces also engaged enemy units, conducting operations in their assigned areas with their characteristic aggressiveness and effectiveness. The South Vietnamese forces, supported by American helicopter gunships, fought a battle on October 13th that resulted in 135 enemy killed, another engagement that contributed to the operation's body count. But despite active searching and despite multiple engagements, the Allied forces couldn't find and engage large elements of the PAVN 3rd Division. The enemy had broken into smaller units, was conducting guerrilla operations rather than conventional battles, was avoiding situations where American firepower would be overwhelming. Operation Irving was declared a success when it ended on October 24th, the Allies claiming they had killed 681 enemy soldiers and captured 1,409 prisoners at a loss of 52 Allied dead, including 19 Americans. The success of Operation Irving was described by some observers as the result of a fluke shot rather than deliberate search and destroy, noting that in most operations, American forces rarely had tactical or strategic initiative against the enemy, that the Communists controlled when and where battles occurred. But from the American command's perspective, Irving demonstrated that sustained operations could produce results, that keeping pressure on enemy forces prevented them from conducting large-scale operations of their own, that even if decisive victory was elusive, the cumulative effect of killing hundreds of enemy soldiers degraded their capability. Operation Thayer II began on October 24th, immediately following Irving's conclusion, a continuation of the campaign to eliminate communist forces from Binh Dinh Province, an operation that would last through the winter into February of '67, nearly 4 months of sustained combat operations that would demonstrate both the capabilities and the limitations of American military power in Vietnam. Thayer II would be hampered by monsoon rains that made movement difficult and that limited air support, would involve some of the most frustrating search operations of the entire campaign, and would ultimately demonstrate that even months of sustained pressure couldn't permanently eliminate enemy presence from areas they'd controlled for years. The focus of Operation Thayer II was again on the Kim Sun Valley and southward to the Soi Ka Valley, searching for enemy forces that intelligence believed had broken into smaller units and were hiding in the mountains and valleys, avoiding major battles while maintaining presence in their traditional base areas. The operation was complicated by weather, the monsoon rains that began in October and continued through the winter, turning dirt roads into mud, making helicopter operations difficult when clouds and rain reduced visibility, flooding rice paddies and raising river levels, and generally making life miserable for soldiers operating in the field. In early December, American commanders made a decision that would have profound effects on the civilian population of the Kim Sun Valley, a decision that demonstrated how the needs of military operations often overrode humanitarian concerns or respect for people's rights to their homes and land. The decision was to empty the Kim Sun Valley of its non-combatant population, to declare the valley a free fire zone where any person observed would be considered enemy and could be engaged without restriction, where unrestricted artillery and airstrikes would be permitted without concern about civilian casualties. Approximately 1,100 people were forced or enabled to leave the Kim Sun Valley, relocated to refugee camps or to towns along the coast, where the government could provide some level of shelter and food. The operation to remove civilians was conducted by American and South Vietnamese forces, soldiers moving through villages announcing that everyone had to leave, helicopters lifting families and their possessions to relocation sites, convoys transporting people by truck to camps that were often unprepared to receive them. Many villagers refused to leave. Some were VC loyalists who supported the communist cause and who had no intention of abandoning their villages to become refugees under government control. Others refused because they didn't trust the government, didn't believe they'd be cared for in camps, didn't want to abandon the land their families had farmed for generations, the homes they'd built, the graves of their ancestors. These people who stayed in the Kim Sun Valley after it was declared a free fire zone accepted that they might be killed by American artillery or airstrikes, that they'd be considered combatants by virtue of remaining in the zone, that they'd chosen to risk death rather than abandon their homes. On December the 17th, American forces conducting Operation Thayer II fought a significant battle east of the Kim Sun Valley that demonstrated the costs of combat operations even when American forces prevailed tactically. That showed how quickly victories measured by body count could become Pyrrhic when American casualties were counted. That illustrated the reality of warfare where both sides suffered losses and where the strategic situation often remained unchanged regardless of tactical outcomes. The battle began when elements of the 1st Cavalry encountered a large enemy force, approximately battalion size, several hundred fighters in prepared positions and terrain that favored the defenders. The initial contact was sudden. American troops moving through an area when enemy forces opened fire from concealed positions, automatic weapons and mortars hitting the Americans before they could take cover, casualties occurring in the first minutes before the Americans could organize a response. The Americans called for supporting fire, artillery bombardments from fire bases positioned to support operations in the area, the howitzers firing missions that dropped high explosive shells on enemy positions, creating explosions that could be heard for miles, that sent shrapnel flying through the air, that killed or wounded anyone not in hardened cover. Helicopter gunships arrived overhead, Huey gunships making gun runs against enemy positions, firing rockets and machine guns, adding their firepower to the artillery, trying to suppress enemy fire and allow American ground forces to maneuver. The battle lasted for hours, American forces attempting to flank enemy positions while supporting arms-pounded suspected locations, enemy forces returning fire and inflicting casualties, neither side gaining decisive advantage for most of the engagement. 3 American helicopters were shot down during the battle, aircraft hit by ground fire while attempting to insert reinforcements or while providing fire support. Pilots and crew killed or wounded when their aircraft crashed. By the time the battle ended, by the time enemy forces withdrew or were driven from their positions, the Americans had killed 95 enemy soldiers, bodies counted on the battlefield, weapons and equipment captured, another tactical victory to report in the body count tallies that were sent to Saigon and to Washington. But American casualties were also severe. 34 soldiers killed in the battle, dozens more wounded. Losses that meant that the units involved would be understrength until replacements arrived, that families in the United States would receive telegrams or visits from casualty notification officers, that the human cost of the operation was accumulating. This battle on December 17th demonstrated a pattern that would recur throughout Operation Thayer II and throughout the war in Vietnam, that American forces could win battles and inflict heavier casualties on the enemy than they suffered themselves, but that the costs were still significant, that favorable exchange ratios didn't eliminate the pain of American losses, that tactical victories didn't necessarily translate into strategic progress. The enemy could replace the 95 soldiers killed in this battle through recruitment and through infiltration from North Vietnam. The Americans could replace the 34 killed through the replacement system that sent new soldiers to Vietnam constantly. But the strategic situation in Binh Dinh Province remained essentially unchanged. The communists still operated in the area, still controlled parts of the countryside, still had the infrastructure and popular support that allowed them to continue fighting. The PAVN and Viet Cong forces operating in Binh Dinh Province during Operation Thayer, II, weren't just avoiding American forces or conducting defensive operations. They were also capable of offensive action, of attacking American positions, of demonstrating that they retained capability to inflict casualties on American forces even as they were being pursued through the mountains and valleys. One of the most significant enemy attacks during this period occurred at Firebase Bird, an artillery position that the 1st Cavalry had established to support operations in the area. Firebase Bird was typical of the fire bases that American forces established throughout Vietnam, a hilltop or ridgeline position where artillery pieces were positioned, protected by defensive fortifications and by infantry security forces, positioned to provide fire support to infantry units operating within range. The firebase was named Bird, following the practice of using random names for tactical positions, names that wouldn't reveal anything about the location or purpose to anyone intercepting communications. The attack on Firebase Bird occurred at night, enemy forces moving into position under cover of darkness, getting close to the perimeter before launching their assault. The attack began with mortar fire, enemy mortar crews firing from positions outside the firebase perimeter, dropping shells onto the hilltop, attempting to destroy the artillery pieces and kill the defenders, creating chaos and confusion that would allow the ground assault to succeed. The ground assault followed the mortar barrage, enemy soldiers moving toward the perimeter, attempting to breach the defenses and get into the firebase where they could destroy equipment and kill or capture American soldiers. The defenders returned fire with everything they had, machine guns and rifles engaging enemy soldiers as they approached, artillery pieces being depressed to fire canister rounds directly at attacking forces, turning the howitzers into giant shotguns that sprayed steel balls at point-blank range. The battle lasted for hours, the enemy making repeated attempts to breach the perimeter, the defenders holding their positions and calling for reinforcements and supporting fire, helicopter gunships arriving overhead to provide fire support despite the darkness and the danger of hitting friendly forces. By dawn, when the enemy withdrew and when the defenders could assess the situation, they counted enemy bodies around the perimeter, evidence of the attack's ferocity, and counted their own. Casualties: Americans killed or wounded defending the firebase. The attack on Firebase Bird demonstrated that the PAVN 3rd Division retained offensive capability despite months of American operations, that they could conduct coordinated attacks on American positions, that declaring an area secure didn't mean enemy forces were eliminated or even seriously weakened. The firebase had held, the defenders had prevented the enemy from overrunning the position, but the attack showed that no American position in Binh Dinh Province was truly safe from enemy action. On January 19, 1967, as Operation Thayer II continued into its fourth month, American forces made a significant discovery that revealed the extent and sophistication of communist base areas in Binh Dinh Province. Patrols from the 1st Battalion, 14th Infantry Regiment, a unit from the 25th Infantry Division's 3rd Brigade that had been attached to the 1st Cavalry for Thayer II, discovered a series of caves in the Suoi Sa Valley, hidden among large granite boulders, concealed by triple canopy jungle vegetation that made them invisible from the air. The caves weren't natural formations that the enemy had simply occupied. They were engineered complexes, tunnels, and chambers that had been excavated over years, fortified with overhead cover that could withstand bombardment, equipped with ventilation systems that allowed hundreds of people to occupy them for extended periods, designed specifically to serve as headquarters and supply depots and training facilities for communist forces operating in the area. When American soldiers began exploring the caves, when they entered the tunnels with flashlights and weapons, moving cautiously through underground spaces where enemy soldiers might be waiting in ambush, they discovered an intelligence bonanza. The caves contained documents, filing cabinets full of papers, records of communist operations in Binh Dinh Province, organizational charts showing command structures, rosters of personnel, weapons and equipment inventories, ammunition supply status reports, maps showing locations of caches throughout the province. The documents included complete local order of battle information, detailed descriptions of every PAVN and VC unit operating in Binh Dinh, their strength and locations and capabilities, exactly the kind of intelligence that American forces needed to conduct effective operations, but rarely obtained. The documents also included classified ARVN materials, papers that the communists had captured or that had been provided by infiltrators or sympathizers, information about South Vietnamese military installations and operations, proof that communist intelligence networks in Binh Dinh were extensive and effective. One document was particularly damaging to South Vietnamese security. It was classified top secret by the South Vietnamese government, and it listed all radio frequencies and call signs for the province's paramilitary forces, information that would allow the communists to monitor South Vietnamese communications and to anticipate their operations. The presence of this document in a communist cave complex demonstrated the weakness of South Vietnamese security, demonstrated that classified information was being compromised, that the enemy had access to intelligence that could be used to plan attacks and ambushes. After the caves were thoroughly searched and documented, after engineers had cataloged everything of intelligence value, the decision was made to destroy the complexes to prevent the enemy from using them again. Engineers placed explosives in one cave and detonated them, creating massive secondary explosions that indicated ammunition or explosives had been stored in the cave. Explosions so large they blew a gap 100 meters long in the side of a hill, a crater that could be seen from considerable distance. Over the next several days, engineers made repeated attempts to destroy the remaining cave complexes, using explosives to collapse tunnels and chambers, trying to make them unusable for the enemy. But the complexes had been well constructed, had overhead cover and structural support that made them difficult to destroy completely even with sustained demolition efforts. Eventually, the engineers settled for sealing the entrances, blocking access to the caves with explosives that collapsed the entrance tunnels, making it difficult but not impossible for the enemy to reopen them. In all, 8 major cave complexes were either closed or destroyed during Operation Thayer II. The discovery demonstrated the extent of communist preparation in Binh Dinh Province, showed that they'd invested years of labor creating underground facilities, that they'd built infrastructure designed to survive American bombardment, and to support continued operations even under sustained pressure from American forces. Operation Thayer II officially ended on February 11, 1967, after nearly 4 months of continuous operations, after the 1st Cavalry Division had conducted countless patrols and air assaults and engagements with enemy forces throughout Binh Dinh Province. The official statistics for Thayer claimed that American forces had killed 1,757 enemy soldiers during the operation, while suffering 242 American dead and 947 wounded. Combined with the casualties from Operation Thayer and Operation Irving, the sustained 5-month campaign in Binh Dinh Province had killed over 2,500 enemy soldiers at a cost of 329 American dead. By the metrics that American commanders used to measure success, the Binh Dinh Province campaign was a victory. The 1st Cavalry had maintained constant pressure on the PAVN 3rd Division, had driven the 2nd Vietnamese Regiment out of Binh Dinh Province entirely and north into Quang Ngai Province, had severely damaged the 18th and 22nd PAVN regiments, had destroyed base areas and supply caches, had killed hundreds of enemy soldiers and captured valuable intelligence. General Norton believed that he'd accomplished the mission, that he'd eliminated or significantly reduced the PAVN 3rd Division's capability to conduct operations in Binh Dinh Province. But the reality was more complicated than the official assessment suggested. The enemy hadn't been eliminated from Binh Dinh Province, hadn't been decisively defeated in the kind of campaign that would prevent them from returning. They'd been worn down, had suffered losses, had been forced to reduce the scale of their operations. But they still had presence in the province, still controlled parts of the countryside, still had the infrastructure and popular support that would allow them to recover and to resume operations. The cost in civilian displacements was staggering. Operations Thayer, Irving, and Thayer II had displaced enormous numbers of people in Binh Dinh Province. By the end of 1966, the province had 85 refugee camps with a reported population of 129,202 people. Additional civilians who'd been displaced by the war crowded into towns and villages, or lived as squatters along Highway 1, the main coastal road. Approximately 1/3 of the 875,000 people in Binh Dinh Province had been displaced during '66, had become refugees either because they fled the fighting or because they were forced by American and South Vietnamese forces to leave areas that were declared free fire zones. The response of the South Vietnamese government and the United States to the refugee crisis was inadequate. Refugee camps were overcrowded, lacked sufficient food and medical care, offered little beyond basic shelter. American journalists who visited the camps reported seeing people packed 30 to a room, receiving inadequate food and medical treatment for diseases and wounds, living in conditions that created sullen depression and anger. Many refugees believed they'd been forced from their homes for no good reason, that the war was destroying their lives, that neither the South Vietnamese government nor the Americans cared about their welfare. While the United States portrayed refugee movement as people fleeing communism, as evidence that the population preferred government control to Viet Cong rule, internal American studies reached different conclusions. Department of Defense analyses showed that the most important cause of refugees was American and South Vietnamese bombing and artillery fire in conjunction with ground operations, that people were fleeing the destruction of war rather than choosing sides, that the massive firepower that made American operations effective also created humanitarian disasters that undermined the political objectives the operations were supposed to achieve. Within months of Operation Thayer, the conclusion, the PAVN 3rd Division began returning to Binh Dinh Province, began re-establishing base areas, began recruiting and training and resuming operations. The 2nd VC Regiment that had fled north to Quang Ngai Province during the operations began returning. The 18th and 22nd PAVN regiments that had been severely damaged began rebuilding their strength through recruitment and through infiltration of replacement soldiers from North Vietnam. The infrastructure that American forces had tried to destroy, the political organization that supported military operations, hadn't been eliminated and began functioning again. The 1st Cavalry Division would launch another major operation in Binh Dinh Province, Operation Pershing, which would begin in early '67 and would continue through '68, another year-long campaign designed to achieve what Thayer and Irving and Thayer II hadn't achieved: permanent elimination of communist forces from the province. Pershing would involve sustained operations, would kill thousands of enemy soldiers, would displace thousands more civilians, would demonstrate again that American forces could win battles but couldn't achieve decisive strategic victory in a province where the enemy had popular support, and where the infrastructure that sustained their operations remained largely intact. This pattern of American operations, followed by enemy return, would repeat throughout the Vietnam War, not just in Binh Dinh Province, but in other provinces throughout South Vietnam. The frustrating cycle of search and destroy operations that achieved tactical success measured in body count, but that didn't achieve strategic success measured in permanent control of territory and population. American forces could defeat enemy forces in battle, could inflict casualties that exceeded their own losses, could destroy base areas and supplies and infrastructure, but they couldn't hold territory permanently because they were needed elsewhere. For other operations, couldn't eliminate the political infrastructure that supported enemy military operations, couldn't win the support of a population that saw American operations as destroying their lives rather than protecting them. The fundamental problem was that the enemy in Vietnam was fighting a different kind of war than American forces were prepared to fight. The communists weren't trying to defeat American forces in conventional battles, weren't trying to seize and hold territory in the way that conventional military forces operated. They were fighting a war of attrition, were willing to accept enormous casualties as long as they could continue operations, were counting on American public support for the war to erode before their will to fight was broken, were willing to wait years if necessary for American forces to withdraw, and for the political situation in South Vietnam to change in their favor. Operation Thayer and the sustained campaign in Binh Dinh Province demonstrated these realities clearly. American forces had conducted the largest air assault up to that point in the war, had killed over 2,500 enemy soldiers, had destroyed base areas and captured intelligence, had demonstrated military capability and firepower and mobility, but none of it had achieved lasting results. None of it had eliminated the enemy's presence in the province. None of it had created conditions where the South Vietnamese government could establish control without continued American support. Behind the statistics of Operation Thayer and the sustained campaign in Binh Dinh Province, behind the numbers of enemy killed and American casualties and refugees displaced, were human beings whose lives were changed forever by the war, whose experiences in those 5 months, from September 66 through February 67, shaped the rest of their lives or ended their lives entirely. The 329 American soldiers killed during operations. Thayer, Irving, and Thayer, too, were young men, most of them in their late teens or early 20s, soldiers who'd joined the Army or been drafted and sent to Vietnam, who'd trained to be infantrymen or helicopter crews or artillerymen or combat engineers, who'd arrived in Vietnam expecting to serve their country, and who died in rice paddies or jungles or on hilltops in a province most Americans had never heard of, fighting an enemy. Most Americans didn't understand. Each of those 329 had families, mothers and fathers who received telegrams or visits from casualty notification officers who learned that their sons had been killed in action, whose lives were forever marked by that loss. Many had wives or girlfriends, young women who'd said goodbye not knowing it would be forever, who'd written letters and sent packages and waited for their men to come home. Some had children, kids who would grow up without fathers, whose memories of their dads would be limited to photographs and stories told by others. The wounded numbered in the thousands during the 5-month campaign. Soldiers who'd been hit by bullets or shrapnel, or who'd been injured in helicopter crashes or vehicle accidents, who'd been medevaused to hospitals in Vietnam, or to military hospitals in Japan or the United States, who recovered from their wounds, or who carried permanent disabilities from injuries sustained in combat. Some would return to duty after recovering, would finish their tours in Vietnam, and return home. Others would be medically discharged, would begin the difficult process of transitioning to civilian life with injuries that limited what they could do and that sometimes affected them psychologically as well as physically. The soldiers who served in the 1st Cavalry Division during this period, who conducted patrols and air assaults and lived in fire-based positions, who experienced combat and fear and exhaustion, and the constant stress of operations in a combat zone, carried psychological effects that wouldn't be fully understood until years later. Post-traumatic stress, nightmares and anxiety, and difficulty adjusting to civilian life after returning home. Relationships strained by experiences that people who hadn't been there couldn't fully understand. The burden of memories that didn't fade even with decades of distance. The enemy forces, the PAVN and VC soldiers who fought against American forces during the Binh Dinh campaign, also suffered enormous casualties. Over 2,500 killed, according to American counts, thousands more wounded. These were also young men, many of them teenagers, soldiers who believed they were fighting for reunification of Vietnam, who had been recruited or conscripted into the PAVN or VC, who'd undergone training and indoctrination, who fought with courage despite being outgunned and outmaneuvered by American forces. The Vietnamese civilians of Binh Dinh Province, the 129,000 who became refugees during the campaign, the unknown numbers who were killed or wounded by bombing and artillery fire and ground combat, suffered in ways that were often ignored in American assessments of the operations. Families were separated, villages were destroyed, rice paddies and farmland were cratered by bombs and scarred by battle. People were forced from homes they'd lived in for generations and relocated to camps where conditions were inadequate. For many Vietnamese civilians, the American operations were disasters that destroyed their lives regardless of which side they supported or whether they tried to remain neutral. The rice farmer whose paddy was bombed during an airstrike, whose home was burned during a search operation, whose son was killed or captured by American forces, developed hatred for Americans that would last a lifetime. The villager forced to leave the Kim Sun Valley when it was declared a free fire zone, relocated to a refugee camp where food was scarce and medical care inadequate, watching children become sick or malnourished, had every reason to blame the Americans for suffering, even if the official narrative said the operations were designed to protect civilians from communist oppression. Looking back at Operation Thayer and the sustained campaign in Binh Dinh Province from the perspective of decades later, the strategic failure becomes clear. American forces won virtually every tactical engagement, killed more enemy soldiers than they lost, demonstrated superior mobility and firepower and capability. But tactical success didn't translate into strategic victory, didn't create conditions where the South Vietnamese government could control Binh Dinh Province without continued American military support, didn't eliminate the communist presence or infrastructure or popular support that allowed the enemy to continue fighting. The fundamental problem was that American strategy in Vietnam was based on assumptions that didn't match the reality of the war being fought. The strategy assumed that killing enemy soldiers faster than they could be replaced would eventually break the enemy's will to fight, that reaching a crossover point where casualties exceeded replacement capacity would force the communists to negotiate or surrender. But the communists could replace losses through recruitment in South Vietnam and through infiltration from the north, could sustain operations for years as long as their political will remained intact, could accept casualties that would be politically unacceptable in the United States. The strategy assumed that American firepower and mobility would be decisive advantages, that the ability to move forces rapidly and to bring massive supporting arms to bear would allow American forces to defeat enemy units in battle and to control territory. But the enemy controlled when and where battles occurred by choosing to engage only when conditions favored them and by avoiding engagement when. American firepower would be overwhelming. They could hide among the population or in base areas in remote mountains or across borders in Cambodia, could wait for American forces to redeploy to other areas, could return to areas they'd been driven from. The strategy assumed that the population would support the government if provided with security, that successful military operations would create conditions where pacification programs could win hearts and minds. But military operations that displaced hundreds of thousands of civilians, that destroyed villages and rice paddies, that killed civilians along with combatants, created hatred and resentment rather than gratitude, undermined pacification efforts rather than supporting them. Operation Thayer demonstrated all these problems clearly. The largest air assault up to that point in the war had failed to trap enemy forces in the Kim Sun Valley because they had detected American preparations and withdrawn. The sustained 5-month campaign had killed over 2,500 enemy soldiers, but hadn't eliminated their presence in Binh Dinh Province. The displacement of 129,000 civilians had created a humanitarian disaster and had alienated much of the population from the government that American forces were supposedly defending. The lessons of Operation Thayer should have been clear to American military and political leaders. Search and destroy operations alone couldn't win the war in Vietnam. body count wasn't a meaningful measure of progress towards strategic objectives. Massive firepower created civilian casualties and displacement that undermined political objectives. The enemy could sustain operations indefinitely as long as they had political will and popular support and safe havens. But these lessons were either not learned or not applied, and the same mistakes would be repeated in other operations in other provinces throughout the war. To fully understand Operation Thayer and why it unfolded the way it did, we need to understand the specific tactics the 1st Cavalry Division used during airmobile operations, how companies and battalions actually conducted air assaults, how they moved through terrain searching for enemy forces, how they responded when the contact occurred. The tactical details reveal both the capabilities that made the 1st Cavalry effective and the limitations that prevented operations like Thayer from achieving strategic success. A typical air assault operation during Operation Thayer began with reconnaissance, scout helicopters flying low over potential landing zones, checking for enemy forces, drawing fire so that gunships could engage enemy positions, gathering information about terrain and obstacles that might interfere with the main assault. The scouts flew OH-13 Sioux or OH-6 Cayuse helicopters, small light aircraft with limited armament, depending on speed and maneuverability to survive when they took fire, which happened frequently, because flying at treetop level made them easy targets. If the reconnaissance indicated the landing zone was cold, meaning no enemy forces were detected, the air assault would proceed with transport helicopters bringing in the infantry. If the LZ was hot, meaning enemy forces were present and engaging the scouts, gunships would conduct gun runs to suppress enemy fire before the transports arrived, firing 2.75-inch rockets and 7.62mm machine guns, attempting to kill or force into cover anyone shooting at the helicopters. The transport helicopters, UH-1 Hueys, approached the landing zone in formation, multiple aircraft arriving simultaneously to get as many soldiers on the ground as quickly as possible, minimizing the time when troops were vulnerable during landing. The helicopters would either touch down briefly to let soldiers jump off or would hover a few feet above the ground if the terrain wasn't suitable for landing, soldiers jumping the last few feet to the ground, moving quickly away from the helicopter to avoid being hit by rotor wash or by enemy fire directed at the aircraft. Once on the ground, the infantry would immediately establish security around the landing zone, setting up defensive positions to protect against enemy counterattack, securing the area so that subsequent lifts could bring in more troops without opposition. The company commander and his radio operators would establish a command post, would coordinate with supporting arms, would begin planning the next phase of the operation based on what they could see of the terrain and based on intelligence about enemy locations. The movement from the landing zone toward objectives varied depending on terrain and enemy situation. In open areas like rice paddies, the infantry moved in tactical formations. Squads spread out to reduce the effect of enemy fire, maintaining visual contact with adjacent units, covering each other's movement. In jungle areas, movement was slower and more cautious, point men leading with the rest of the unit following, everyone alert for ambushes or booby traps. Visibility limited to a few meters in triple canopy jungle. When contact occurred, when the unit engaged enemy forces or came under fire from concealed positions, the response was immediate and violent. Soldiers would return fire while taking cover. Machine gunners would engage with sustained fire to suppress enemy positions. The company commander would call for artillery support and helicopter gunships. Radio operators would transmit contact reports to battalion headquarters. If the enemy force was small, a squad or platoon, the company might assault directly, using fire and maneuver to close with and destroy the enemy. If the enemy force was larger or in prepared positions, the company might fix them in place and call for reinforcements. Additional companies airlifted into blocking positions to trap the enemy between converging forces. The supporting arms available to companies conducting operations during Operation Thayer were extensive. Artillery fire from 105mm and 155mm howitzers positioned at fire bases could deliver high explosive or white phosphorus rounds on targets within minutes of the call for fire, forward observers with the companies adjusting fire to hit enemy positions. Helicopter gunships could arrive within minutes, orbiting overhead and making gun runs when directed by ground commanders. Tactical air support from Air Force or Marine fighters could deliver bombs and napalm and strafing fire, though coordinating airstrikes required more time and required that the aircraft be available and that weather permitted their use. Medical evacuation was a critical capability that saved countless lives during Operation Thayer. When soldiers were wounded, medical evacuation helicopters, Hueys marked with red crosses, would be called to the unit's location, would fly into landing zones that might still be under fire, would land or hover while wounded were loaded aboard, would fly them to field hospitals where surgeons could treat serious wounds. The rapid evacuation, often getting wounded soldiers to surgical facilities within minutes of being hit, meant that soldiers survived wounds that would have been fatal in previous wars, where hours might pass before wounded could reach medical care. At night, units conducting operations during Thayer would establish defensive positions, setting up perimeter defenses with listening posts outside the perimeter to provide early warning of enemy approach, establishing fields of fire, and preparing artillery defensive targets that could be called if the position was attacked. Sleep came in shifts, some soldiers on watch while others tried to rest, everyone ready to respond if the enemy probed or attacked the perimeter. Darkness in Vietnam was absolute in jungle areas. Visibility without artificial light measured in inches rather than feet. Every sound potentially, enemy movement or just animals or vegetation moving in wind. The resupply of units in the field was conducted by helicopter, Hueys bringing in water and ammunition and food, hovering over positions or landing in clearings, kicking out supplies or having them unloaded by soldiers, flying out before enemy fire could be directed at them. Water was critical in Vietnam's heat and humidity, soldiers consuming gallons of water daily to prevent heat casualties. Water resupply almost as important as ammunition resupply. The sea rations that soldiers ate, canned meals that were usually eaten cold because lighting fires would reveal positions, provided nutrition but not much satisfaction, food that soldiers joked about and complained about, but that kept them functioning. The statistics about refugees created by Operation Thayer and the sustained campaign in Binh Dinh Province, the numbers of people displaced and camps established, don't capture the human experience of becoming a refugee, of losing your home and your land and everything familiar, and being relocated to a camp where conditions were difficult and where the future was uncertain. Understanding what happened to the 129,000 civilians displaced during the operations requires understanding what their lives were like before displacement, what the process of forced relocation involved, and what life in refugee camps was like. For a rice farming family living in the Kim San Valley before Operation Thayer, life followed patterns established over generations. The family lived in a village, a collection of homes built with whatever materials were available, typically bamboo and thatch, structures that weren't permanent by American standards, but that served their purpose and that could be rebuilt if destroyed. The family farmed rice paddies that had been in the family for generations, land that had been cleared and leveled and irrigated by ancestors, land whose productivity was known from years of harvests, land that represented wealth and security and connection to the past. The daily routine involved work in the paddies, planting during the rainy season and harvesting during the dry season, maintaining the dikes that controlled water flow, preparing the land for the next planting. The work was hard and required the entire family's participation, children working alongside parents as soon as they were old enough to help. The rice harvest determined whether the family would eat well during the year or would struggle, determined whether there would be surplus to sell or trade for other necessities, or whether every grain would be consumed by the family. The village had a social structure, relationships, and obligations that connected families, celebrations, and religious observances that brought the community together, a way of life that had persisted through French colonial rule and through the First Indochina War and through the division of Vietnam and through the years of the American War. The village had connections to the Viet Cong, some people actively supporting them, some forced to provide supplies or shelter, some trying to avoid involvement, but caught in the middle anyway. When American and South Vietnamese forces arrived to relocate the village during Operation Thayer II, when soldiers appeared and announced that everyone had to leave because the valley was being declared a free fire zone, the reaction varied. Some people complied immediately. understood that resistance was useless, began gathering what possessions they could carry and preparing to leave. Others refused, said they wouldn't abandon land. Their families had farmed for generations, said they'd rather die than become refugees. Still others pleaded with the soldiers, asked to be allowed to stay, promised they weren't Viet Cong, begged for exceptions that weren't going to be granted. The forced relocation was conducted with a combination of inducements and threats. Helicopters would transport people and possessions to relocation sites, which was portrayed as assistance, as the government helping people evacuate from areas that would become combat zones. But the underlying message was clear. If you don't leave voluntarily, you'll be forced to leave. And if you remain after the deadline, you'll be considered enemy and will be subject to attack by artillery or airstrikes or ground forces operating in the free fire zone. Families made agonizing decisions about what to take and what to leave behind. They could carry only what they could lift onto helicopters or load onto trucks, which meant leaving behind furniture and tools and stored rice and all the accumulated possessions of a lifetime. They had to leave behind the land itself, the rice paddies that represented their wealth, the homes they'd built, the graves of ancestors that connected them to the past. They were told the relocation was temporary, that they could return after military operations concluded. But many suspected they'd never see their villages again, that the government and Americans would find reasons to keep them in camps permanently. The refugee camps where displaced people were relocated were unprepared for the sudden influx of thousands of people. The camps were typically established quickly on land near coastal towns, areas cleared and divided into sections where families were assigned spaces to build shelters. The government provided some materials for shelter construction and provided rice rations, but the amounts were often inadequate for the population. Water sources were limited and often contaminated. Medical care was minimal or non-existent. Sanitation was poor, creating conditions where diseases spread rapidly. Life in the camps was difficult physically and psychologically. Families lived in crowded conditions, sometimes 30 people in shelters designed for fewer, no privacy and no space for normal family life. The rice rations kept people from starving, but weren't sufficient for adequate nutrition, especially for children who needed more than adults. Without their land to farm, without work to occupy their time, men became idle and depressed, felt useless and powerless, watched their families suffer without being able to improve the situation. Many refugees blamed the Americans for their suffering, saw the forced relocation as destroying their lives for no good reason, resented being told the relocation was for their protection when it felt like punishment. The official narrative that people were fleeing communism rang hollow to families who'd been forcibly relocated, who'd lost everything, who saw no benefit from government control, and who remembered their lives before the war as better than their lives in the camps. This resentment created support for the Viet Cong among people who might have been neutral, created future insurgents among children who grew up in camps and who blamed Americans and the government for their families' suffering. Understanding Operation Thayer requires understanding not just the American perspective, but also how the PAVN 3rd Division and the Viet Cong forces in Binh Dinh Province viewed the operation, how they planned their response, how they made decisions about when to fight and when to withdraw, how they survived 5 months of sustained American operations and maintained capability to return afterward. The enemy's perspective reveals why operations like Thayer achieved tactical success without strategic victory. For the commanders of the PAVN 3rd Division, the American presence in Binh Dinh Province and the series of operations beginning with Masher and continuing through Thayer represented both a threat and an opportunity. The threat was obvious. American firepower and mobility could inflict enormous casualties on PAVN and VC forces if they stood and fought conventional battles, could destroy base areas and supplies, could disrupt operations and training. But the opportunity was that American operations were temporary, that American forces would eventually redeploy to other areas, that patience and survival would allow communist forces to return and resume operations. The strategy the 3rd Division employed during Operation Thayer was based on avoiding decisive engagement with American forces while maintaining presence in Binh Dinh Province and preserving combat capability for future operations. This meant breaking into smaller units when large American operations began, dispersing forces to make them harder to find, moving to sanctuary areas in the mountains or across borders where American forces couldn't or wouldn't pursue them. The strategy accepted that some casualties would occur, that some base areas would be destroyed, that operations would be disrupted, but it prioritized survival of the organization and of trained soldiers who could rebuild and resume operations after American forces withdrew. The intelligence network that Communist forces maintained in Binh Dinh Province was critical for implementing this strategy. The network included informants in villages who would observe American and South Vietnamese military movements and report them to VC agents, included infiltrators in South Vietnamese military and government offices who provided information about planned operations, included radio intercepts that provided tactical information about American locations and intentions. This intelligence allowed Communist forces to anticipate American operations, to withdraw from areas before air assaults occurred, to avoid areas being swept by American battalions. When the B-52 strikes occurred before Operation Thayer began, when Communist forces heard the bombers overhead and felt the ground shake from impacts, they knew a major operation was beginning. When they observed the massive helicopter movements on September the 13th and 14th, when 5 battalions were inserted simultaneously into the highlands around the Kim Sun Valley, they knew the Americans were conducting an air assault designed to trap them. The decision was made to avoid the trap, to disperse forces and move east toward the coastal mountains, where the terrain was more defensible and where the population was denser, providing more opportunities to hide among civilians. The PAVN 3rd Division's regiments conducted fighting withdrawals during Operation Thayer, engaging American forces when they had advantages of terrain or surprise, inflicting casualties when possible, but breaking contact before American supporting arms could be brought to bear decisively. The September 17th battle that cost 34 American lives was an example of this approach, a significant engagement that demonstrated continuing Communist capability, but that ended with enemy forces withdrawing rather than being destroyed. These engagements served multiple purposes. They inflicted American casualties, which had psychological and political effects. They provided combat experience for troops, and they demonstrated to the population that Communist forces were still fighting rather than being driven out. The displacement of civilians from the Kim Sun Valley and other areas during Operation Thayer, too, was viewed by Communist forces as both a loss and a potential benefit. The loss was obvious. The population provided food and intelligence and recruits. Losing access to villages meant losing these resources. But the benefit was that civilians who were forced from their homes and relocated to camps often became more sympathetic to the communist cause, saw the government and Americans as responsible for their suffering, and some would eventually provide support, or would allow family members to join communist forces. Throughout the 5 months of sustained American operations in Binh Dinh Province, the PAVN 3rd Division maintained its organizational structure and its ability to conduct operations even while being pursued and attacked. The discovery of the cave complexes with extensive documentation showed how thoroughly communist forces had prepared for sustained operations, had created infrastructure designed to survive American pressure. The caves contained supplies that could support forces for months, had secure communications facilities, had training areas where new recruits could be indoctrinated and trained, had hospitals where wounded could be treated. The strategy proved effective when, within months of Operation Thayer 2's conclusion, communist forces began returning to Binh Dinh Province. The 2nd VC Regiment came back from Quang Ngai Province. The 18th and 22nd PAVN regiments rebuilt their strength through new recruitment and infiltration. Base areas were re-established in the same valleys where American forces had destroyed them. The infrastructure that had survived the operations resumed functioning. The pattern that would repeat throughout the war was demonstrated in Binh Dinh. American tactical success, followed by communist return. Operation Thayer was the largest air assault undertaken up to that point in the Vietnam War, a massive operation involving 5 battalions inserted simultaneously into the highlands surrounding the Kim Sun Valley, an operation that demonstrated American capability to move large forces rapidly and to conduct complex operations in difficult terrain. But for all its scale and complexity, for all the firepower and mobility and resources committed to it, Operation Thayer didn't achieve its strategic objectives, didn't eliminate communist forces from Binh Dinh Province, didn't create lasting change in a province that remained contested throughout the war. The sustained campaign that included Operations Thayer, Irving, and Thayer II killed over 2,500 enemy soldiers and cost 329 American lives, displaced 129,000 civilians, and created 85 refugee camps, destroyed base areas, and captured intelligence and demonstrated American military capability. But within months of the campaign's conclusion, enemy forces were returning to Binh Dinh Province, were re-establishing base areas, were resuming operations, were demonstrating that American operations achieved temporary effects rather than permanent results. The soldiers of the 1st Cavalry Division, who fought in Binh Dinh Province during those 5 months from September 66 through February 67, did everything asked of them. They conducted air assaults into hot landing zones, patrolled through difficult terrain, searching for enemy forces, engaged in firefights when they found them, called in artillery and airstrikes, destroyed enemy positions and supplies, endured monsoon rains and heat, and the constant stress of operations in a combat zone. They fought with courage and skill against an enemy who was determined and capable, and they achieved tactical success in virtually every engagement. But the strategic situation in Binh Dinh Province remained essentially unchanged by their efforts. The enemy returned, the population remained caught between the two sides, the South Vietnamese government couldn't establish effective control, and the war continued. This was the tragic reality of the American war in Vietnam. That young men could fight and die in operations that achieved tactical success, but that didn't contribute to strategic victory. That suffered in a war where the metrics of success were flawed and where the strategy was based on assumptions that didn't match the nature of the conflict. The 129,000 civilians who became refugees during the operations suffered in ways that were often overlooked in assessments that focused on military metrics. Families were destroyed, villages were eliminated, land that had been farmed for generations was abandoned or declared free fire zones. People who'd lived as productive farmers became dependent on inadequate government. Assistance in overcrowded camps. The humanitarian cost of operations measured by tactical success was enormous and created lasting damage to the social fabric of Binh Dinh Province. Operation Thayer and the sustained campaign in Binh Dinh Province should have taught clear lessons about the war in Vietnam. Search and destroy operations alone couldn't achieve strategic victory. Body count was a misleading measure of progress. Massive firepower and displacement of civilians undermined political objectives. The enemy could sustain operations indefinitely as long as they had political infrastructure and popular support. But these lessons were either not learned or not applied, and similar operations would continue throughout the war with similar results. The 329 Americans who died during the Binh Dinh campaign died in operations that achieved impressive tactical results by conventional military standards. They killed enemy soldiers in numbers that exceeded American. Losses by more than 7-1. A favorable exchange ratio that in previous wars might have led to decisive victory. But Vietnam wasn't a conventional war where favorable exchange ratios led to victory, and the deaths of those 329 Americans contributed to tactical success without strategic meaning. Operation Thayer deserves to be remembered not as a failure of the soldiers who fought in it, but as a demonstration of how flawed strategy leads to tragic outcomes, even when tactical operations are conducted with skill and courage. The largest air assault, the most sophisticated tactics, the bravest soldiers, the most advanced technology, none of it could overcome a strategy that assumed enemy forces would fight the kind of war Americans were prepared to fight, that assumed tactical success would translate into strategic victory, that assumed metrics like body count measured progress toward meaningful objectives. The legacy of Operation Thayer is the legacy of the Vietnam War itself, the tragedy of young men sent to fight in operations that couldn't achieve lasting results, of civilians displaced by military operations designed to protect them, of tactical success masking strategic failure, of courage and sacrifice in service of a strategy that couldn't win the war it was designed to fight. The soldiers who fought in Operation Thayer, the civilians whose lives were destroyed by it, the enemy soldiers who died defending territory they believed was theirs, all deserve to be remembered as part of the larger tragedy of the Vietnam War,